The fastest way to discover who people really are is to let them believe you have no power. Those were the words my grandfather repeated throughout my childhood, and I never truly understood them until the afternoon my own wife asked security to throw me out of the building I had quietly protected for more than a decade. My name is Nathan Whitmore. I'm 43 years old, born and raised in Connecticut, and for most people looking at me that afternoon, I was just another middle-aged man wearing faded blue jeans, a navy button-down shirt, and brown leather boots that had seen better days. I didn't look like someone who belonged inside Bellamy Tower. I wasn't wearing a tailored suit. I didn't have an executive badge clipped to my belt. I wasn't surrounded by assistants carrying tablets or talking into wireless headsets. I looked ordinary, almost forgettable, and that was exactly how I preferred it. The revolving glass doors reflected a gray October sky as I stepped into the marble lobby carrying nothing except a weathered leather portfolio. The building smelled faintly of polished stone, fresh coffee, and expensive perfume. Every surface gleamed beneath the afternoon light pouring through the 30-foot windows. Employees hurried across the lobby with laptops tucked beneath their arms, conversations about quarterly reports and investor meetings blending into a constant hum that echoed beneath the high ceiling. It had been months since I'd walked through those front doors during business hours. Normally, I entered through another entrance, one almost nobody inside the company even knew existed. But today Arthur Bellamy had specifically asked me to meet him upstairs before the board session. He said there were a few things only I could approve in person. I checked the time on my watch. 2:23. 7 minutes early. Right on schedule. Then I heard a familiar voice behind me. Nathan. I turned slowly. Claire stood near the reception desk wearing an ivory pantsuit that probably cost more than my pickup truck's monthly payment. Her blonde hair rested perfectly against her shoulders, every detail carefully arranged for another important afternoon. She had always carried herself with confidence, but lately confidence had quietly become something colder. She stared at me with the same expression someone might wear after finding muddy footprints across a freshly cleaned floor. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Her tone wasn't curious. It was cautious, almost irritated. I offered a small smile. "I have a meeting." She looked around quickly, making sure none of her co-workers had missed the conversation. Unfortunately for both of us, several already had. A group of analysts slowed their pace. 2 receptionists stopped typing. Someone carrying coffee pretended to study the digital directory while listening. Claire lowered her voice, but not enough. "Nathan, this isn't the place for jokes." "I'm not joking." "Who invited you?" "Someone expecting me upstairs." She folded her arms. "You can't just wander into executive headquarters because you feel like it." I noticed the embarrassment in her eyes before I noticed the frustration. It wasn't fear that I would cause trouble. It was fear that people from work would connect her carefully built professional image to the quiet husband who preferred fixing old furniture over attending networking parties. During our 12 years of marriage, I'd watched that distance grow one polite conversation at a time. She stopped introducing me at company events. She stopped asking my opinion about her work. Eventually, she stopped believing there was anything important about the man she came home to every evening. I never argued. Respect isn't something you demand. It's something another person chooses to give. Claire glanced toward the elevators, then back at me. "Nathan, please leave before someone important sees this." I almost answered, but another employee approached and smiled politely at Claire. "Everything okay?" he asked. Claire forced a laugh that sounded practiced. "Just a little misunderstanding." She looked directly at the security desk. "Actually," she lifted one hand and motioned toward the uniformed officer standing nearby. "Could you help me? This man isn't supposed to be here." The words landed softly, almost gently, yet they echoed louder than any shout ever could. The security officer nodded professionally and began walking toward me while conversations throughout the lobby faded into an uncomfortable silence. I remained exactly where I was, my portfolio resting calmly at my side, my heartbeat steady, remembering my grandfather's voice all over again. Sometimes the truth doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it simply waits for everyone else to finish making their assumptions. The security officer stopped about 6 feet in front of me, his expression calm, professional, and completely unaware that he had just walked into the middle of a story much larger than he could possibly imagine. His name tag read Mike Reynolds. Mid-50s, former military by the posture, wedding ring polished from years of habit, the kind of man who preferred solving problems quietly. He offered me a courteous smile before speaking. "Good afternoon, sir. I am going to need to ask you to come with me." There was no accusation in his voice, only procedure. I appreciated that. "May I ask why?" I replied. Mike glanced toward Claire for only a second before looking back at me. "I received a request that you are not authorized to remain in the executive lobby." I nodded once. "I understand." Claire released a slow breath, almost relieved that I was not making a scene. That was what she expected from me. Over the years, I had become predictable in her eyes. I did not argue. I did not interrupt. I did not compete with louder personalities. Somewhere along the way, she had mistaken patience for weakness. Around us, more people slowed their pace. Conversations dissolved into whispers. In corporate offices, curiosity always traveled faster than elevators. A young financial analyst stopped pretending to check his phone. Two assistants stood beside the coffee station, speaking without making a sound. Even the receptionist kept glancing between me and Claire instead of answering the ringing telephone beside her desk. Claire folded her arms again, standing straighter now that she believed the situation was under control. "Nathan," she said quietly, "please do not make this more uncomfortable than it already is." I looked at her for a long moment. I remembered another October afternoon 12 years earlier when we were newly married, eating hot dogs from a street cart after getting caught in the rain because we could not afford a taxi. She laughed when my jacket was soaked. She told me she admired how calm I stayed when everything went wrong. Back then, she used to call that quality strength. Somewhere between promotions, bonuses, and executive dinners, she began calling the very same quality a lack of ambition. Success changes people in ways they rarely notice themselves. "I never intended to embarrass you," I said. She looked almost offended. "You already have." Those 4 words settled over the polished marble floor with surprising weight. I could see she believed them completely. In her mind, appearances had quietly become reality. Mike shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the personal direction of the conversation. "Sir," he said gently, "if you would come with me, we can sort everything out outside." "Of course," I answered. I started walking beside him without resistance. The whispers grew louder behind us. Someone quietly laughed. Someone else murmured that I must have been trying to sneak into an executive event. It was remarkable how quickly complete strangers could construct an entire life story from less than 30 seconds of observation. As we approached the security desk, Mike lowered his voice. "For what it is worth, you have been respectful the entire time." I smiled faintly. "Thank you. You are simply doing your job." He nodded with visible appreciation. Professional respect often begins with recognizing it in someone else. Before either of us reached the revolving doors, every elevator in the lobby suddenly stopped moving. A soft electronic chime echoed through the building. The private elevator at the far end of the lobby, the one almost no employee ever used, illuminated with a discreet gold light above the doors. I noticed several executives immediately straighten their posture. One vice president quietly adjusted his tie. Even the receptionist instinctively stood. Whatever conversation had been spreading across the lobby disappeared all at once. The atmosphere changed without anyone announcing why. "Mike," followed everyone's gaze toward the private elevator. "That is unusual," he whispered. I simply watched the doors. They opened with deliberate silence instead of the familiar mechanical sound used by the public elevators. An older gentleman stepped into the lobby wearing a charcoal suit without a single company logo or executive badge. He did not need one. Arthur Bellamy had founded Bellamy Technologies 38 years earlier inside a rented warehouse with 3 folding tables and 1 used computer. Every employee knew his face, even if very few had ever spoken with him directly. He rarely visited headquarters anymore. When he did, entire departments reorganized their schedules around his arrival. Arthur walked at an unhurried pace, acknowledging greetings with a polite nod, but never stopping. Several executives instinctively moved toward him. Claire did the same, smoothing the front of her jacket before offering the polished corporate smile she reserved for senior leadership. Arthur did not slow down. He continued walking past department heads, vice presidents, and directors as though he were searching for someone else entirely. Mike quietly removed his hand from the access card clipped to his belt. Claire's smile faded by almost invisible degrees. Arthur's eyes remained fixed on one person across the lobby. Me. Nobody spoke. The entire lobby seemed to inhale at the same time as Arthur Bellamy continued walking with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent 4 decades building something that no longer needed introductions. His polished shoes echoed softly across the marble floor, each step measured, each second stretching longer than the one before it. I remained exactly where I was. Mike Reynolds instinctively stepped aside, unsure whether he should continue escorting me outside or wait for instructions from the man whose signature still appeared on every employee handbook in the company. Claire's expression shifted from confidence to confusion. She straightened her shoulders again, assuming Arthur was approaching one of the executives standing behind me. It would have been the reasonable assumption. People like me were rarely the destination. We were, usually just part of the background. Arthur stopped less than 3 feet away. His face softened into a warm smile that I had not seen in almost 6 months. "Nathan," he said, extending his hand. "You are exactly on time." I shook his hand firmly. Traffic was lighter than expected. He laughed quietly. "You always did leave yourself an extra 30 minutes, just in case." Around us, the silence became almost uncomfortable. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. Claire stared without blinking. I could almost hear everyone trying to solve the same impossible equation. How did the founder of Bellamy Technologies know the casually dressed man security had just been asked to remove? Arthur looked toward Mike first. "Everything all right here?" Mike answered honestly. "Sir, I was informed this gentleman was not authorized to remain in the lobby." Arthur nodded thoughtfully, never showing irritation. "You handled the situation professionally." Mike relaxed just enough to exhale. "Thank you, sir." Arthur turned toward Claire. "And you are?" She immediately recovered her corporate composure. "Claire Whitmore, Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships." Arthur smiled politely. "I have heard good things about your department." Relief briefly crossed her face before disappearing again. "Thank you, sir." Then Arthur asked a question so calmly that it almost sounded conversational. "May I ask why you believe Mr. Whitmore should be removed?" Claire hesitated. For the first time since I had entered the building, uncertainty replaced certainty. I assumed he was not authorized to be here. Arthur tilted his head slightly. "Based on what?" She looked toward me, then back to Arthur. He does not normally attend executive meetings." Arthur did not answer immediately. He had always been comfortable allowing silence to do part of the work. Years earlier, he once told me that people often revealed more while trying to fill quiet moments than they ever did during direct questioning. Finally, he spoke. "Assumptions are expensive in business." No anger. No raised voice. Just a simple observation that somehow carried more weight than criticism ever could. He reached inside the inner pocket of his suit jacket and removed a small black leather case. The gold Bellamy emblem reflected beneath the lobby lights. Every executive nearby recognized it instantly, although very few had ever seen one outside photographs. Arthur opened the case carefully and removed a brushed titanium access key attached to a simple black leather strap. It did not look impressive. No diamonds. No decorative engraving. Just a precisely machined piece of metal carrying a discrete serial number beneath the company crest. Arthur held it toward me. "I believe this belongs with you." I accepted it without ceremony. The cool weight settled naturally into my palm. Claire looked from the key to my face as though neither one belonged in the same reality anymore. One of the vice presidents quietly whispered something under his breath. Another executive actually took a small step backward. Arthur smiled again. "I have been holding on to that since the security system finished its annual upgrade. I wanted to hand it back to you personally." I slipped the key into my pocket. "I appreciate that." Claire finally found her voice. What is that?" Arthur answered before I could. "The master access credential." He spoke as though explaining something ordinary. "It opens every secured area in Bellamy Tower, including facilities that even senior executives cannot enter without authorization." The words drifted across the lobby with astonishing calm. Nobody reacted immediately because nobody wanted to believe they had heard them correctly. Arthur continued speaking. "There are only 2 active master credentials in existence. Mine and Nathan's." This time the silence was absolute. Even the reception phones seemed to have stopped ringing. I watched Claire's expression carefully. Shock arrived first, then disbelief, then something quieter and far more painful. She was no longer looking at the man she believed she understood. She was looking at a stranger whose life had apparently continued far beyond the version she had created inside her own mind. Arthur rested one hand lightly against my shoulder. "The board has been waiting upstairs for nearly 10 minutes, he said, with a smile. "I promised them we would begin as soon as our most trusted advisor arrived." Arthur's words lingered in the air long after he finished speaking. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed willing to breathe too loudly, as though the entire lobby had become afraid of interrupting a moment they could not explain. I looked toward Claire only briefly. Her eyes remained fixed on the titanium key that had disappeared into my pocket. It was never really about the piece of metal. It was about everything that key represented. For years, she had measured importance by titles printed on office doors, reserved parking spaces, and names appearing on quarterly reports. The one thing she never considered was that the people carrying the greatest responsibility often had the least interest in announcing it. Arthur adjusted the cuff of his jacket and smiled toward the small crowd gathering around us. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in his calm, unmistakable voice, "we are running behind schedule." The sentence broke the silence like the first drop of rain before a storm. Executives immediately returned to motion, though not naturally. They walked more slowly now, glancing toward me with expressions that had completely replaced curiosity with caution. A few nodded respectfully as they passed. Others simply avoided eye contact altogether, uncertain how they were supposed to treat someone they had overlooked only moments earlier. Mike Reynolds cleared his throat softly. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "I owe you an apology." I shook my head before he could continue. "No, Mike. You treated me with professionalism and respect from the beginning. You followed the information you were given. That is exactly what you were supposed to do." Relief spread across his face. "I appreciate you saying that." Arthur looked toward him and nodded. "Integrity is doing the correct thing even when the circumstances are unclear. Thank you for remembering that." Mike stood a little straighter. Recognition from the founder himself was something most employees would remember for the rest of their careers. Claire finally stepped forward. "Nathan," she began quietly. It was the first time that afternoon she had spoken my name without impatience. I turned toward her. She searched my face as though hoping to find some clue that this entire situation was an elaborate misunderstanding. "Why did you never tell me?" she asked. The question sounded almost fragile. I answered honestly. "You never asked." She blinked several times. 12 years together, and I never knew any of this. "You knew everything that mattered to me," I replied. "You knew I valued honesty. You knew I enjoyed rebuilding old furniture on weekends. You knew I preferred quiet dinners over corporate galas. You knew I answered every phone call from my mother because family mattered. Those things were always real. My work was simply never the most important thing about me." She lowered her eyes for a moment, and I could almost see memories rearranging themselves inside her mind. Every evening, I came home in ordinary clothes. Every business trip I described only as consulting work. Every invitation I politely declined because confidentiality mattered more than recognition. None of those had ever been lies. They were simply incomplete pictures. Arthur rested both hands lightly on the top of his cane. Age had slowed his walk, but never his awareness. "Nathan has spent many years helping this company solve problems that never appeared in annual reports," he said. "Some of our greatest successes remained invisible because he preferred them that way." Claire looked back toward Arthur. "He works for Bellamy Technologies?" Arthur smiled. "Not exactly." He paused long enough for every nearby employee to listen again. "Nathan has never been an employee. He has been my most trusted independent advisor for 12 years. Every major security redesign, every executive succession review, every confidential infrastructure audit has crossed his desk before it crossed mine." I noticed several executives exchange surprised glances. Even many of them had not known the full extent of my role. Confidentiality only works when very few people are aware it exists. Claire slowly shook her head. "I do not understand." "You are trying to understand my position," I said gently. "But that is the wrong question." She looked at me, without speaking. "The better question is why my position suddenly changes how you see me." The words were not intended to hurt her. They were simply true. There was no anger left in my voice, only quiet disappointment. Arthur checked his watch. "The board has already delayed long enough." He looked toward me with the familiar expression he wore before every difficult meeting. "We have an acquisition proposal waiting upstairs, along with a cybersecurity report that only you have reviewed." I nodded once. "Then we should not keep them waiting." Arthur gestured toward the private elevator. As we started walking together, employees instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path without anyone asking them to. I heard whispers behind us, but they sounded different now. Nobody was laughing anymore. Just before the elevator doors closed, I glanced back one final time. Claire remained exactly where she stood near the reception desk, surrounded by dozens of co-workers, yet looking more alone than I had ever seen her. She was not staring at the founder. She was not staring at the executives. She was staring at the man she thought she had known for 12 years, realizing that respect should never have depended on discovering what was hidden behind a closed door. The private elevator closed with barely a whisper, sealing off the noise of the lobby as the polished steel doors reflected Arthur Bellamy and me standing side by side. Neither of us spoke for the first few seconds. The elevator climbed smoothly, almost silently, while the city skyline drifted farther below through the glass wall behind us. Arthur had always respected silence. He believed people who were comfortable with quiet usually had nothing to prove. Finally, he smiled without looking away from the skyline. I suppose today did not unfold exactly the way either of us expected. I let out a quiet breath. Not exactly. He chuckled. You are handling it better than I would have. I am not sure about that. He turned toward me. Nathan, I have known you for 12 years. I have watched you negotiate billion-dollar security strategies without raising your voice. I have watched you convince stubborn board members using nothing except patience and facts. But I also know that today was personal. I looked down at the titanium master credential resting comfortably in my hand before slipping it back into my jacket pocket. Business problems usually have clear solutions. Personal ones are rarely that simple. Arthur nodded slowly. Claire did not know. No. Would it have changed anything if she had? The question lingered inside the elevator longer than I expected. I thought back to the small apartment where Claire and I had started our marriage. We had mismatched furniture bought from yard sales, a coffee maker that only worked if someone held the lid down, and one old pickup truck that constantly needed repairs. We were not impressive back then, but we laughed often. She admired people who worked hard instead of showing off. Somewhere during the following decade, success slowly changed the standards by which she measured everyone around her. I answered honestly. If knowing my title was necessary for her to respect me, then the title was never the real issue. Arthur sighed quietly. That is a painful truth. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor. Thick carpet absorbed every footstep. The hallway felt completely different from the rest of the building. No crowded workstations. No ringing telephones. Just understated elegance, original artwork, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. A pair of executive assistants immediately stood as Arthur stepped into the corridor. Good afternoon, Mr. Bellamy. Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore. They greeted me naturally, exactly as they always had. Nothing about their expressions suggested surprise because, unlike most of the company, they already knew who regularly attended confidential board sessions. One of them handed me a thin black folder. The revised acquisition documents arrived 20 minutes ago. The cybersecurity appendix is highlighted. Thank you, Susan. Arthur smiled at her. Has everyone arrived? Yes, sir. They are waiting in the conference room. Arthur looked at me before we continued walking. Ready? Always. The boardroom doors opened into a space that could have belonged to any Fortune 500 company, except for one detail. There were no oversized displays celebrating quarterly profits or stock prices. Instead, framed photographs lined one wall, showing Bellamy Technologies during different stages of its history. A tiny warehouse with peeling paint. 20 employees gathered around folding tables. The first manufacturing facility. The first satellite office overseas. Arthur believed companies forgot who they were the moment they stopped remembering where they began. 11 board members rose from their seats as we entered. Some I had worked with for years. Others had joined more recently. Every one of them greeted me by name before returning to business. Nathan, good to see you. Glad you could make it. Their familiarity would have surprised anyone downstairs. Arthur took his seat at the head of the table, but did not immediately begin the meeting. Instead, he folded his hands together. Before we discuss today's agenda, I would like to address something important. Several board members looked toward him with curiosity. Arthur continued. A situation occurred in the lobby involving Mr. Whitmore. It reminded me how easily organizations begin judging people by appearances instead of character. Nobody interrupted. Our greatest strength has never been technology. It has never been capital. It has always been trust. Once people begin believing titles deserve more respect than integrity, decline begins quietly, long before financial reports reveal it. I noticed several directors exchanging thoughtful looks. Arthur rarely gave speeches without a reason. "Nathan," he said, turning toward me, "would you begin with the infrastructure assessment?" I opened the folder and connected my laptop to the conference display. A detailed digital blueprint of Bellamy Tower appeared on the screen, followed by dozens of color-coded security evaluations. Within seconds, the room shifted completely into business mode. Questions came quickly: access control, vendor compliance, data redundancy, physical security integration, executive travel protocols. I answered each one calmly, supporting every recommendation with documentation rather than opinion. Nearly 40 minutes passed before anyone noticed the discreet knock on the conference room door. Susan stepped inside with a hesitant expression. "I apologize for interrupting." Arthur looked up. "Yes." She glanced toward me briefly before returning her attention to Arthur. "There is someone outside requesting a few minutes with Mr. Whitmore. She says it is extremely important, and she has been waiting ever since the board meeting began." I already knew who it was before Susan quietly spoke the final two words. "It is Claire." The conference room remained completely silent after Susan spoke Claire's name. Nobody around the table reacted with curiosity or amusement. They simply waited. That was another lesson Arthur had taught me years earlier. Important decisions should never be made while emotions are still speaking louder than judgment. Arthur folded his hands together and looked at me with the patience that had earned him the respect of everyone in the room. "The decision is yours," he said. "The meeting can wait 5 minutes if necessary." I glanced at the presentation still displayed across the large screen. The acquisition proposal represented months of preparation, but it was not going anywhere. Claire, on the other hand, was probably experiencing the longest afternoon of her professional life. 5 minutes, I replied. Arthur nodded. "We will take a short recess." The directors quietly stood, some walking toward the windows overlooking Manhattan, while others poured fresh coffee. Nobody asked unnecessary questions. Confidentiality was part of the culture on this floor. I stepped into the hallway, where Susan waited beside the closed conference room doors. "She is in the executive lounge," she said softly. She seemed different. I smiled faintly. "I imagine she is." The executive lounge overlooked the Hudson River through floor-to-ceiling windows. It was normally used for private conversations before board meetings. Claire stood near the glass with both hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup she had barely touched. She turned the moment she heard my footsteps. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence felt familiar, but not comfortable. It reminded me of the quiet evenings we had shared during the past 2 years, sitting in the same house, while somehow living separate lives. She looked exhausted. Not physically, but emotionally. The confidence she carried downstairs had disappeared, replaced by uncertainty. "Thank you for seeing me," she said quietly. "Of course." She lowered her eyes for a moment before looking back at me. "I do not even know where to begin." "Start wherever the truth begins." She gave a small, nervous laugh that quickly disappeared. "I have been replaying everything that happened downstairs over and over." She paused. "I keep wishing I could go back 5 minutes and make different choices." I nodded without interrupting. She deserved the chance to speak honestly. "When I saw you walk into the lobby," she continued, "I assumed you were there because you wanted to surprise me. I thought you did not understand how executive headquarters worked." She swallowed carefully. "Then I realized the problem was that I did not understand you." I remained quiet. Sometimes people only discover their own thoughts after hearing themselves say them aloud. Claire looked toward the river before continuing. "Do you remember when we first met?" "Yes. You were driving that old blue pickup truck that sounded like it was falling apart every time you started it." I smiled. "It usually was." She laughed softly for the first time that afternoon. "I loved that truck because you loved it. You never cared whether anyone else thought it was impressive." Her smile slowly faded. Somewhere along the way, I started caring far too much about what other people thought. The words were painfully honest. "Corporate life changes people," I said, "only if they allow it to." She looked directly into my eyes. I allowed it. The admission hung between us. There was no excuse attached to it. No attempt to blame coworkers, promotions, or ambition. Just responsibility. I respected that. "Nathan," she whispered, Did I really become someone who only respected success when everyone else could see it? I considered the question carefully before answering. Not overnight. She waited. It happened gradually. At first, you simply enjoyed your work. Then you became proud of your accomplishments. There is nothing wrong with either of those things. But eventually, every conversation became about titles, influence, executive circles, and who mattered inside the company. You stopped asking whether people were kind. You started asking whether they were important. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she did not look away. And I treated my own husband like he did not belong. You treated me like someone whose value depended on a job description. She nodded slowly. That is worse. Another long silence settled over us. Outside the windows, ferries crossed the river exactly as they had every day for years. The city continued moving, completely unaware that two people were quietly confronting 12 years of marriage inside a room high above the streets. Claire finally spoke again. Arthur said you helped build the company's security systems. Part of them. Why did you never tell anyone? I smiled gently. Because the safest systems are usually designed by people nobody notices. She studied my face carefully. Was today the first time you ever felt embarrassed because of me? I answered without hesitation. No. She closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of that single word. When she opened them again, they looked older somehow, as though an entire illusion had disappeared in one afternoon. Before either of us could continue, there was another gentle knock at the lounge door. Susan stepped inside with an apologetic expression. Mr. Whitmore, the board is ready whenever you are. Also, there is something you should probably know. During the recess, the preliminary internal audit you requested last month has just flagged several unusual approvals inside the Strategic Partnerships Division. The report includes Vice President Evan Brooks and requires immediate executive review. The words settled over the room with surprising weight. An internal audit. Strategic Partnerships. Evan Brooks. I looked at Susan for a brief moment before taking the tablet she extended toward me. Claire remained perfectly still beside the window, her eyes shifting from my face to the confidential report displayed on the screen. The color drained from her expression as she recognized the department name. That is my division, she said quietly. Susan nodded with professional restraint. The automated compliance system detected irregular approval chains during the scheduled monthly review. The audit team elevated the findings because several authorizations bypassed standard governance procedures. Claire looked at me. I have never bypassed company policy. I believe you, I answered without hesitation. She searched my face, almost surprised that I had answered so quickly. You do? Yes. She frowned. After everything that happened downstairs? I slipped the tablet beneath my arm. Questioning your judgment is not the same as questioning your integrity. Those are two different things. She lowered her eyes, and I could almost see the relief mixing with regret. Susan excused herself and returned to the boardroom, leaving the two of us alone once again. Claire looked toward the report in my hand. Evan signs most of the vendor recommendations before they reach me. I review the contracts, but I trusted the supporting documentation. Her voice became quieter. I never imagined. She stopped herself. Trust is necessary, I said. The problem begins when trust replaces verification. She gave a slow nod. That sounds like something Arthur would say. I smiled faintly. Actually, that one came from my father. We stood in silence for another few seconds before I turned toward the conference room. Claire spoke before I reached the door. Nathan. I stopped. If the audit proves there are problems inside my department. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Do not protect me because I am your wife. I turned back toward her. She looked exhausted, but there was something different in her expression now. For the first time in years, ambition was no longer the loudest voice in the room. Character was beginning to speak again. I never have, I replied gently. And I never will. She nodded once. I understand. I returned to the boardroom where every director had already resumed their seats. Arthur watched me enter without asking what had been discussed. He simply recognized the look on my face. We have another matter, I said as I connected the tablet to the presentation system. The acquisition documents disappeared, replaced by a compliance dashboard filled with timelines, authorization records, and vendor activity. The atmosphere around the table changed immediately. This was no longer a strategic planning session. It had become a governance review. Susan informed me that the monthly automated audit generated a priority alert. I began. At first glance, The financial totals appear accurate. However, the authorization pathway does not. One director leaned forward, meaning, I enlarged a section of the report. Company policy requires independent verification whenever contracts exceed $25 million. These records indicate that verification was digitally acknowledged, but the associated review files do not exist. Another director adjusted his glasses. Could it be a software error? I shook my head. That was my first assumption. I tapped another section of the screen. Then I compared the metadata. The room grew quieter. Every missing verification occurred under the same executive chain. The requests originated through Vice President Evan Brooks. Arthur remained silent, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. I continued. More importantly, each approval occurred while the assigned compliance officer was traveling or unavailable. Temporary delegates approved the transactions without access to the complete documentation. A director frowned. Was the money stolen? There is no evidence of missing funds, I answered. At least not yet. Several shoulders relaxed slightly. Then what is the risk? I changed to another slide showing a network of outside consulting firms connected through ownership records. Vendor concentration. The room studied the chart. These consulting companies appear independent. They are not. 4 of them share overlapping ownership structures and executive officers. Bellamy Technologies believed it was hiring competing firms. In reality, the contracts were flowing into the same corporate network. Arthur finally spoke. Conflict of interest. Exactly. I looked around the room. Whether intentional or not, someone created an approval process that eliminated meaningful oversight. The directors exchanged serious looks. No one rushed to conclusions. That was one of the reasons Arthur trusted this board. Facts always came before opinions. After several moments, Arthur folded his hands together. Has anyone informed Mr. Brooks? No. Susan answered from the back of the room. The alert was delivered only to executive governance. Arthur nodded once. Good. It remains that way. He turned toward me. Nathan, I want you to lead the review personally. Understood. Choose your own team. Report only to the board until we understand the full picture. I accepted the responsibility with a single nod. As the meeting resumed, I could not help thinking about Claire's final words before I left the executive lounge. Do not protect me because I am your wife. She still did not know where the evidence would lead. Neither did I. But one thing had already become clear. The most dangerous assumption made inside Bellamy Tower that day had not happened in the lobby. It had happened months earlier, when someone believed nobody would ever notice the quiet man whose job was simply to see what everyone else overlooked. The meeting continued for another hour, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Nobody around the table cared about projected revenue anymore. Every conversation returned to governance, accountability, and verification. Arthur always believed that trust was the foundation of every successful company, but he believed something else just as strongly. Trust without accountability eventually became negligence. When the board adjourned, several directors remained behind to review supporting documents while I gathered my notes into the same worn leather portfolio I had carried into the building that afternoon. Arthur waited until everyone else had left before speaking. Nathan, I have one request. I looked up. Of course. I do not want assumptions driving this review. He smiled slightly. Not favorable assumptions. Not unfavorable assumptions. Only facts. That was already the plan. He nodded with quiet satisfaction. That is why I asked you to lead it. As we walked toward the executive hallway together, Arthur rested one hand lightly on my shoulder. There is something else you should know. I waited. Evan Brooks requested an unscheduled meeting with me 3 weeks ago. That caught my attention. About what? He suggested that Bellamy Technologies should rely less on outside advisors and more on internal leadership. Arthur smiled without bitterness. He specifically questioned why someone who was not officially listed on the executive roster had access to confidential governance matters. I remained silent. I asked him a simple question. Arthur continued. I asked whether he had ever found a flaw in your work. And Arthur chuckled quietly. He could not answer that one. We reached the executive hallway where Susan was waiting with another folder. Mr. Whitmore, she said, I compiled the historical approval records you requested. I accepted the folder. Thank you. There is one detail that stood out. She opened the file to a bookmark page. Every questionable authorization was routed through the Strategic Partnerships Division, but none of them carried Claire Whitmore's direct digital signature. They were approved through delegated authority while she was attending conferences, client meetings, or executive travel. I studied the timeline. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Claire had remained the visible department head, while someone else quietly controlled critical decisions during carefully selected windows of time. Arthur looked over the documents beside me. Interesting. Very, I agreed. It suggests planning rather than coincidence. Susan nodded. The audit software reached the same preliminary conclusion. Arthur folded the folder closed. Then we proceed carefully. Later that afternoon, I walked downstairs alone instead of using the private exit. I wanted to see the building from the same perspective as everyone else. Employees filled the lobby once again, moving between meetings with coffee cups, laptops, and hurried conversations. A few recognized me from earlier. Their expressions had completely changed. Some offered polite nods. Others quietly stepped aside as I approached. Respect earned through surprise always felt uncomfortable. Respect based on character lasted much longer. Mike Reynolds stood near the security desk finishing paperwork. The moment he noticed me, he smiled. Heading out for the day, Mr. Whitmore? For a few hours. He laughed. Long day. Longer than expected. He hesitated before speaking again. If it means anything, my wife asked what happened after I got home for dinner. I told her the story. I raised an eyebrow. And she said something that stayed with me. He smiled. She said a person's job title tells you what they do. Their behavior tells you who they are. I nodded appreciatively. Your wife sounds wise. She usually is. We shook hands before I turned toward the revolving doors. Just outside the building, I heard someone call my name. Claire stood near the sidewalk beside her car. She had changed out of her heels into comfortable flats, something she only did after especially exhausting workdays. She walked toward me slowly. I was hoping you had not left yet. I was just leaving. She looked at the evening traffic moving through Manhattan before speaking. Human Resources informed me that an audit team will begin reviewing my division tomorrow morning. Yes. Some people are already whispering. I could imagine that. Corporate buildings often generated rumors faster than facts. Are you afraid? I asked gently. She thought about the question for several seconds. Not of the audit. She met my eyes. If I made mistakes, I want to know. If someone used my trust against the company, I want that uncovered. She paused. What I am afraid of is realizing how blind I became while chasing the next promotion. The honesty in her voice reminded me of the woman who had once celebrated our first apartment even though the kitchen ceiling leaked every time it rained. Success had buried that version of Claire beneath years of expectations and appearances. Perhaps she was finally finding her way back. I opened the passenger door of my old pickup truck and placed my portfolio inside. Claire looked at the faded paint, the worn leather seats, and the small crack across the dashboard. You still drive it. I smiled. It still runs. She laughed softly. You have not changed very much. I closed the door gently. Maybe not. She nodded once. I think that is something I should have appreciated much sooner. As the evening sun reflected across the glass walls of Bellamy Tower behind us, I realized that the investigation waiting inside the building was no longer the only truth about to come into the light. Sometimes the hardest audit is not the one performed on a company. Sometimes it is the quiet examination of the choices that slowly reshape a person's character until one ordinary afternoon forces them to finally see themselves clearly. The audit began at 8 o'clock the following morning. Bellamy Tower looked exactly the same from the outside, but inside the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations became quieter whenever members of the governance team walked through the halls carrying sealed folders. Conference room doors stayed closed longer than usual. Calendars filled with meetings that had not existed 24 hours earlier. That was the nature of accountability. It rarely arrived with drama. It arrived with documentation. I spent most of the morning reviewing approval records with a small team that Arthur and the board had personally authorized. Every conclusion required evidence. Every assumption had to be challenged. By early afternoon, the picture had become remarkably clear. The financial transactions themselves had benefited the company. There was no missing money, no hidden accounts, and no fraudulent payments. The real problem was the process. Evan Brooks had quietly redirected high-value contracts through a network of consulting firms connected by undisclosed business relationships. The vendors had delivered acceptable work, But Bellamy Technologies had been denied the opportunity to evaluate truly independent alternatives. It was not theft. It was a serious conflict of interest that violated every governance standard the company had spent decades building. More importantly, every delegated approval had been carefully timed during periods when Claire was traveling, presenting at conferences, or meeting clients. Her authority had been used as a shield, while someone else quietly manipulated the process. By late afternoon, Arthur called a special executive session. Evan arrived looking confident, carrying the same polished smile I had seen countless times in corporate boardrooms across the country. He greeted everyone with effortless charm until Arthur placed the audit report in front of him. "Please take your time," Arthur said calmly. Evan read the first few pages without concern. Then his expression slowly changed. He turned another page, then another. The room remained completely silent. Finally, he looked up. "This is a misunderstanding." Arthur folded his hands. "Then help us understand." Evan began explaining market efficiencies, long-term vendor relationships, and strategic flexibility. He spoke well. Confident people often do. Then I quietly projected the ownership chart onto the conference room screen. Every consulting company ultimately connected to the same parent organization through layers of limited liability companies and shared directors. The timeline showed exactly when delegated authority had been activated and exactly who had benefited from each decision. Facts have a remarkable quality. They do not become weaker simply because someone dislikes them. Evan stopped talking. The board voted unanimously to place him on administrative leave pending the final compliance review. The decision contained no anger, no raised voices, and no celebration. It was simply the consequence of verified evidence. After the meeting, Arthur remained seated while everyone else departed. Claire quietly entered a few minutes later. She had already been informed of the preliminary findings. She looked tired, but there was also relief in her eyes. "The report cleared me," she said softly. "It also showed where stronger oversight was needed," I replied. She nodded. "I should have asked more questions." Arthur smiled kindly. "Leadership is not about never making mistakes. It is about being willing to learn from them before they become habits." Claire thanked him before turning toward me. "May we walk downstairs together?" I agreed. We rode the public elevator instead of the private one. Employees greeted us politely, though the whispers from the previous day had disappeared. Rumors had been replaced by official communication, and truth has a way of making speculation unnecessary. When we reached the lobby, Mike Reynolds opened the front door with the same professional courtesy he offered every visitor. Nothing about his behavior had changed, and I respected him even more because of it. Outside, the autumn air felt cooler than the day before. Claire stood beside me on the sidewalk for a long moment before speaking. "I spent years believing that success meant being recognized by important people." She looked up at the glass tower reflecting the evening sky. "Yesterday, I realized something much harder." I waited. The person whose respect mattered most was standing beside me all along, and I almost lost sight of him because I was too busy chasing everyone else's approval. I smiled gently. "Respect is never proven by titles." She nodded. "It is proven by how we treat people before we know what they can do for us." Those words stayed with me long after we left the building. A few weeks later, the board adopted every governance recommendation from the audit. Vendor policies were strengthened. Delegated approvals required additional verification. Transparency became more important than convenience. Claire remained with the company, determined to rebuild her department through accountability rather than appearances. She earned that opportunity by accepting responsibility instead of avoiding it. As for me, very little changed. I still drove the same old pickup truck. I still preferred quiet weekends restoring worn furniture instead of attending networking events. The Titanium Master credential remained in my jacket, used only when necessary and never displayed for attention. People often assume that real influence looks loud. My grandfather knew better. He once told me that the strongest keys are usually the ones hidden in plain sight because they open doors that pride alone can never unlock. Looking back, I realized the most valuable thing I carried into Bellamy Tower that afternoon was never the master credential waiting in Arthur's pocket. It was the quiet certainty that character does not become valuable after the world finally recognizes it. Character was valuable all along.